Your kids can eat when you get home, my dad said, tossing them napkins, while my sister boxed a $150 truffle hamburger for her boys. Her husband laughed, telling me to feed them first next time. I just said, got it. When the waiter returned with the $1,200 bill, I stood up and made a move that would destroy their perfect illusion forever. I am Gabrielle, 34 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful forensic accountant, I escaped their toxicity, but maintained occasional contact. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Atlanta meant keeping up appearances, especially in our church community. My parents, Winston and Brenda, were obsessed with image. Inside our home, emotional coldness permeated every corner, unless you were my older sister, Vanessa. Tonight we were sitting at Le Petit, one of the most exclusive steakhouses in the city. The crystal chandeliers sparkled above us, casting a warm glow over the white tablecloths, but I felt nothing but freezing tension. I was a single mother to my two beautiful sons, Elijah, who is 8, and Miles, who is 6. They sat quietly beside me, sipping their waters. My parents had insisted on this family dinner to celebrate my brother-in-law, Connor. Connor was a white tech startup CEO, who my parents worshipped like a savior. He married Vanessa 5 years ago, and ever since he could do no wrong. They left their kids at home with a private nanny tonight. I brought mine because my father insisted it was a family event. Yet, when it came time to order, the reality of our family dynamic was put on full display. The waiter arrived with a silver tray carrying the most expensive cuts of Wagyu beef and truffle-infused sides. Connor ordered a massive tomahawk steak and a $150 truffle burger specifically to be boxed up and taken home to his sons. Vanessa ordered sea bass, and my parents ordered prime rib. When I tried to order chicken tenders and mashed potatoes for Elijah and Miles, my father slammed his hand on the table. He leaned over, lowering his voice so the neighboring tables would not hear. He told me this establishment was too expensive to waste money on children who would rather eat fast food. He said your kids can eat when you get home. Then he tossed 2 cheap paper napkins from his pocket at my boys, telling them to wipe their faces. Vanessa smirked, adjusting her designer necklace. Connor let out a loud, arrogant laugh. He leaned back in his leather chair and told me I really should feed them first next time I come to a place like this. My mother, Brenda, simply nodded and told me to listen to Connor because he knows how things work in high society. Elijah looked up at me with tears welling in his brown eyes, asking if he did something wrong. I pulled him close and whispered that he was perfect. I looked at my father, my mother, my sister, and her smug husband. Decades of being the scapegoat boiled in my veins. My childhood bedroom had been a sanctuary from this exact type of cruelty. They always treated me like an unwanted guest while Vanessa got the world handed to her. I smiled politely, picked up my glass of sparkling water, and told Connor I understood completely. I told them to enjoy their meals. I sat there for the next hour watching them feast while my boys colored quietly on the paper placemats the hostess had given them. The tension thick in the air was finally interrupted when the waiter approached our table holding a sleek black leather book. The bill. It was well over $1,200. Connor did his usual routine. He patted his tailored jacket pockets, heavily sighing and claiming he must have left his wallet in his rental car. He always drove a rented Porsche to look wealthy. My father immediately panicked, looking at the bill, and then turned his sharp gaze directly at me. He demanded that I cover the check since Connor had just treated us all to a boat trip last month. A boat trip I was not even invited to. I looked around the table at these people who shared my blood, but showed me no love. They assumed I was just a struggling single mom doing basic paperwork. They had no idea I was a silent partner at a major private equity firm, pulling in 7 figures a year. I reached into my designer bag, which I kept hidden under the table, and pulled out my heavy metal Centurion card. The black card clinked against the table, catching the waiter's eye immediately. But I did not hand it over to pay for their feast. Instead, I stood up my chair, scraping against the hardwood floor. I looked directly at the waiter and asked him to call the general manager to our table right now. Connor rolled his eyes, muttering about how dramatic I always get. Vanessa scoffed, telling me to just pay the bill and stop embarrassing them. I ignored them completely. When the manager hurried over, recognizing me instantly as one of their top corporate sponsors, I handed him my card. I told him to pay for my water and to permanently cancel my corporate VIP sponsorship for this restaurant group immediately. I also told him to publicly decline any future transactions from Connor because his tech company had officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy this very morning. The blood instantly drained from my brother-in-law's face. My father gasped, dropping his heavy crystal wineglass in absolute shock. The real show just started. The manager stood frozen for a split second before his professional training kicked in. He nodded respectfully, taking my metal card, and walked swiftly toward the register. Back at the table, the silence was deafening. Connor sat there with his mouth slightly open, his arrogant smirk completely wiped away. His face turned a pale shade of gray as he frantically looked around to see if anyone at the neighboring tables had heard me. Vanessa was the first to break the silence. Her voice was shrill and trembling as she slammed her hands on the table, demanding to know what kind of lies I was spreading about her husband. She yelled that I was just a jealous, bitter single mother trying to ruin their perfect evening. My mother, Brenda, immediately rushed to comfort Vanessa, rubbing her back and glaring at me as if I had just committed a major crime. My father, Winston, leaned across the table, his face flushed with anger and his voice a harsh whisper. He demanded that I sit down and stop making a scene in front of important people. I did not sit down. I looked down at Connor, who was now pulling at the collar of his expensive dress shirt, sweating profusely. I told him that my private equity firm was the exact firm that reviewed and subsequently denied his desperate request for an emergency bridge loan last week. I told him I saw his financials and I knew he had been running his tech startup like a personal piggy bank, draining investor funds to lease his luxury cars and buy Vanessa's designer bags. Connor tried to stammer out a defense, claiming it was just a temporary cash flow issue and a standard corporate restructuring, but his voice cracked and his hands were shaking. Rather than holding the actual liar accountable, my parents turned all their fury onto me. My mother hissed that I was vindictive and cruel. She said Connor was just going through a tough business cycle and that real families support each other during hard times. My father pointed his finger at me, telling me I had humiliated him in his favorite restaurant and that I was a disgrace to our family name. He said I was intentionally trying to destroy my sister's happiness because I could not keep a man myself. The cruelty in his words was familiar, but it still stung. However, I was no longer the little girl crying in her blue bedroom. The manager returned with my receipt and my card. I signed the slip, leaving a massive $500 tip for the waiter who had to witness this mess. I looked at my father and told him that since I just paid for his prime rib and his golden son-in-law's $150 burger, my kids and I would be leaving to get that fast food he suggested. I took Elijah and Miles by their hands and walked out of the restaurant with my head held high. The crisp night air felt amazing as the valet brought my car around. Once we were safely inside my SUV, Elijah asked from the back seat if Grandpa was mad at us. I looked at him through the rearview mirror and smiled gently. I told him Grandpa was just confused, but that nobody was mad at them, and that we were going to go get the biggest ice cream sundaes in the city. As I drove toward the ice cream parlor, my phone sitting in the cup holder began to vibrate continuously. Buzz after buzz, lighting up the dark cabin of the car. I did not need to look at the screen to know what was happening. The family group chat was exploding. Later that night, after the boys were bathed and tucked comfortably into their beds, I finally sat at my kitchen island and opened the messages. There were over 40 texts. My mother started the barrage, calling me a malicious and spiteful woman. She wrote that I had always been jealous of Vanessa's beauty and success, and that tonight was my pathetic attempt to tear down a good man. Vanessa chimed in with paragraphs of insults, threatening to sue me for defamation and claiming Connor was on the verge of a multi-million-dollar buyout. Reading their words brought back a flood of painful memories. I remembered being 17 and finding out my college tuition fund had been emptied. My father had drained the account to buy Vanessa a brand new convertible for her college graduation because he said she needed to arrive at her new marketing job in style. When I cried about my missing tuition, they told me I was smart enough to get student loans and that I needed to stop being so selfish. They always demanded my sacrifice to fund her luxury. The final message in the group chat was from my father. It was a long text declaring that my behavior was unchristian and unacceptable for a member of his family. He stated that as a deacon of the church, he could not have a toxic presence disrupting his peace. He officially banned me from attending Sunday service and told me not to contact them or show up at their house until I was ready to issue a formal public apology to Connor. I set the phone face down on the marble counter and took a deep breath. They wanted an apology. They wanted me to bow down and protect the illusion of the white savior son-in-law who was actively defrauding them. They had no idea how deep Connor's financial crimes actually went. They only knew about the Chapter 11 bankruptcy of his company. They did not know what I had discovered the previous night while digging deeper into his personal accounts. The next morning, I woke up with a clear mind. After dropping the boys off at their private school, I headed straight to my downtown office. Vanessa happened to be at the same school drop-off, handing out lavish birthday invitations for her son to all the wealthy mothers in the parking lot. She purposefully walked right past my car, ignoring Elijah and Miles completely. Suddenly, Connor pulled up in his rented Porsche. He stepped out aggressively, storming over to my car window. He slammed his hand on my door and threatened me to stay out of his business, telling me I was playing with fire. I just calmly looked at his rental license plate and rolled my window up in his face. Driving away, I felt a cold determination. When I arrived at my office, I locked the door and opened my specialized tracking software. I was not just looking at his company anymore. I was looking at my parents' personal assets. What I found next would burn their entire world to the ground. I sat in the quiet hum of my office, staring at the glowing monitors. My fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard, pulling up public records property deeds, and utilizing the specialized financial databases my firm had access to. I started with Connor's startup. The Chapter 11 filing was a mess of unpaid vendors and empty promises, but that was just the surface. I needed to know how he had been funding his lavish lifestyle while the company bled dry. I ran a trace on the corporate accounts and found a web of shell companies. Then I checked my parents' public financial records. They had always been so proud of their fully paid-off four-bedroom home and the $800,000 retirement fund my father had built through decades of strict budgeting. I accessed the banking registry and my heart stopped. Their retirement accounts were completely empty. The balance was zero. Every single penny had been systematically drained over the past 6 months and wired into an offshore crypto exchange registered under one of Connor's shell companies. He had not just borrowed their money, he had stolen their entire life savings under the guise of an startup investment. A cold realization washed over me. My parents, who had worked their entire lives, who were so obsessed with their image in our community, were now financially ruined by the white savior they worshipped. I did not cry for them. Instead, I printed every single ledger, every wire transfer receipt, and every offshore account statement. I slid the thick stack of papers into a red manila folder. The following Sunday morning arrived with a heavy downpour. My father had explicitly banned me from attending service at the church where he was a deacon until I apologized to Connor. But I was not the frightened little girl anymore. I dressed in a sharp, tailored charcoal suit, grabbed my keys, and drove straight to the church, leaving the boys at home with a trusted sitter. I slipped into the back pew just as the choir was finishing their opening hymn. The sanctuary was packed with hundreds of people dressed in their Sunday best. My parents sat in the front row, Vanessa and Connor right beside them, looking like the perfect wealthy family. When it was time for community announcements, my father Winston stepped up to the wooden podium. He adjusted his glasses and looked out at the congregation. His chest puffed out with pride. He spoke into the microphone, his voice echoing through the high ceilings. He started talking about blessings and financial abundance. He wiped a fake tear from his eye and told the entire church how God had blessed their family with a brilliant son-in-law. My father praised Connor for being a visionary. Then Connor stood up, buttoning his expensive suit jacket, and walked up to join my father at the podium. Connor took the microphone and smiled his charming, deceitful smile. He announced to the church that he had just helped my parents secure a $500,000 second mortgage on their home to invest in a revolutionary new project that would double their wealth in 6 months. The congregation erupted into applause. People were clapping and shouting praises. Vanessa beamed, waving at her friends in the pews. I sat perfectly still in the back row, my blood running cold. My parents had actually mortgaged their paid-off house to give this fraudster another $500,000. They had literally handed him the roof over their heads. Connor looked out over the crowd, soaking in the admiration, and for a brief second his eyes locked with mine in the back row. His smile faltered just a fraction. He knew I was watching. Later that afternoon, my parents hosted a post-service barbecue at their house to celebrate their new investment. The smell of smoked hickory and grilled chicken filled the humid Atlanta air. The backyard was filled with church members eating ribs and potato salad. Despite the ban, I walked right through the side gate and stepped onto the patio. Vanessa was sitting in a lawn chair, wearing oversized designer sunglasses and sipping a mimosa. She looked so smug, completely unaware that her husband was building their life on stolen money. Conversations quieted down as I approached the main table where Connor was holding a beer and bragging to the other men about tech valuations. My mother Brenda hurried over, grabbing my arm tightly, her acrylic nails digging into my skin. She hissed at me, asking what I was doing there and demanding that I leave before I ruined their celebration. I pulled my arm away gently but firmly. I walked up to Connor. The crowd gathered around, watching the tension build. I looked him dead in the eye and asked him 3 simple questions. I asked him what the tax liabilities were for a second mortgage cash out when the primary borrower is over 65. I asked him which escrow account the $500,000 was currently sitting in. And finally, I asked him how a company that filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy 3 days ago plans to guarantee a 100% return on investment within 6 months. The silence in the backyard was absolute. Connor's face turned bright red. He stammered, spilling a bit of his beer on his shoes. He tried to laugh it off, telling the crowd that I was just a jealous accountant who did not understand high-level venture capital. But the panic in his eyes was unmistakable. My father pushed through the crowd, his face contorted with pure rage. He pointed his finger right at my face and yelled at me. He told me I was a bitter, miserable woman who could not stand to see her sister happy. He said I was cursing the family blessing and ordered me to get off his property immediately. I looked at my father, who was fiercely defending the man, currently robbing him blind. I nodded slowly. I told him I hoped the barbecue was worth it, and I walked out of the yard. I did not go to the police. Connor was smart enough to have my parents sign the documents, making the transfer look like a willing investment. Calling the cops would just lead to a lengthy investigation while he moved the money and hid his tracks. I needed a faster, more ruthless solution. The next morning, I sat in my office and made a private call to the regional director of the bank that held my parents' new $500,000 mortgage. My private equity firm did billions in business with them. Banks love offloading risky loans, especially when the collateral is residential real estate tied to a shaky tech entrepreneur. I told the director I wanted to purchase the debt. I used my firm to anonymously buy the entire mortgage note from the bank. The transaction was approved and finalized within 48 hours. The paperwork was signed, sealed, and delivered to a secure vault. I was no longer just the scapegoat daughter. I was legally my parents' creditor. I owned the debt to their home. The morning after the paperwork for my parents' mortgage was securely locked in my vault, I woke up with a profound sense of peace. For the first time in my life, the toxic grip my family held over my emotions was completely severed. I made breakfast for Elijah and Miles, taking my time to listen to them talk about their upcoming science projects. The Atlanta air was crisp and cool as we piled into my SUV for the morning commute. My boys attended Oak Ridge Academy, an elite private school known for its rigorous academics and wealthy student body. I paid their steep tuition out of my own pocket, unlike Vanessa, who constantly relied on my parents to cover her son's extra expenses. As I pulled into the sprawling drop-off circle bordered by manicured hedges, I immediately spotted Vanessa. She was standing near the grand stone entrance holding court among a group of wealthy stay-at-home mothers. Vanessa was dressed in a pristine white tennis skirt and an oversized designer sweater, acting as if she had just finished a grueling match at the country club. In her manicured hands, she held a stack of thick gold-foiled envelopes. As the boys and I walked toward the entrance, I could see what she was doing. She was passing out invitations for her son's upcoming birthday party. The mothers around her were gushing over the extravagant details as Vanessa loudly bragged about the petting zoo, the catered dessert bar, and the professional photographer they had hired. Elijah and Miles walked beside me, their heavy backpacks bouncing with each step. They saw their aunt and naturally gravitated toward her, smiling and waving. Vanessa looked right at them, her eyes cold and dismissive. She deliberately turned her back, handing a gold envelope to the mother of a child who was notorious for bullying other students. She made a grand show of inviting every single child in the vicinity except her own nephews. Elijah looked up at me, his smile fading into a look of quiet confusion. He asked why Aunt Vanessa did not give him an envelope for his cousin's party. My heart ached for him, but I refused to let my sister's cruelty taint his morning. I knelt down right there on the pristine walkway, looking him directly in his eyes. I told him that we already had special plans for that weekend, and that we were going to an indoor water park, just the three of us. His eyes immediately lit up, and the disappointment vanished. Miles cheered, pumping his small fists in the air. I kissed their foreheads and watched them run happily through the grand double doors of the school. They were safe and they were loved. That was all that mattered. As I turned around to walk back to my vehicle, the loud, aggressive roar of a sports car engine shattered the quiet morning atmosphere. A sleek black Porsche slammed on its brakes, pulling illegally into the reserved loading zone right next to my SUV. The heavy driver's side door swung open and Connor stepped out. He was not wearing his usual polished business suit. His tie was loose, his shirt was wrinkled, and he had dark circles under his pale blue eyes. The charming tech CEO facade he usually wore was completely gone, replaced by the frantic energy of a cornered animal. He marched directly toward me, his jaw clenched tight. Vanessa noticed him and started to walk over, but Connor held up a hand, stopping her in her tracks. He wanted to deal with me alone. He backed me up against the side of my vehicle, invading my personal space in an attempt to physically intimidate me. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and pure desperation. He hissed at me, telling me that I needed to back off. He said my little stunt at the barbecue, asking him about escrow accounts and tax liabilities, had upset my parents and caused unnecessary stress for Vanessa. He jabbed his finger toward my face, telling me that I was playing a very dangerous game and that I had no idea who I was messing with. He claimed his startup was on the verge of a massive venture capital injection, and that when he was a billionaire, he would make sure I was entirely cut off from the family wealth. I stood my ground, completely unfazed by his pathetic display of dominance. I did not flinch or look away. I just stared at him, studying the sweat beading on his forehead. He was projecting. The threats were hollow, and we both knew it. While he continued to ramble about lawyers and defamation suits, my eyes drifted over his shoulder to the black Porsche idling behind him. It looked impressive to the untrained eye, but my background in forensic accounting meant I noticed the small details. I saw the tiny fleet barcode sticker neatly adhered to the lower corner of the rear windshield. I noticed the generic license plate frame from a high-end rental agency near the airport, He was paying a daily premium to lease a luxury car he could not afford just to maintain the illusion of success while secretly funneling my parents' retirement money to cover his hidden debts. I looked back into his panicked eyes and let a slow, deliberate smile spread across my face. I told him he did not need to worry about me asking any more questions. I spoke softly, making sure my voice carried a tone of absolute certainty. I told him that the truth always balances the ledger eventually, and that his account was already deeply overdrawn. Connor swallowed hard, the muscle in his jaw twitching nervously. He opened his mouth to fire back another insult, but the words seemed to get stuck in his throat. He stepped back, breaking the close contact. Without another word, I opened my car door, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. I rolled my window down just enough to look at him one last time. I told him to make sure he returned the Porsche with a full tank of gas because the rental agency charges steep penalty fees for empty tanks. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost standing in the middle of the school parking lot. Vanessa finally rushed over to his side, demanding to know what I had just said to him. I did not stick around to hear his stuttering response. I put my car in drive and pulled away, leaving them standing in a cloud of exhaust. Driving back toward the city center, I felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with pure vindication. Connor thought he could use my parents against me and intimidate me into silence. He thought I was just a bitter sister harboring childhood grudges. He had absolutely no idea that the silent partner of the private equity firm that now owned the second mortgage on my parents' home was the very woman he just tried to bully. The pieces on the board were perfectly aligned, and he was completely blind to the fact that checkmate had already been called. I reached over and turned up the radio, letting the smooth rhythm of the music wash over me as I prepared for the final phase of my plan. The drive to my downtown office after leaving Connor in that school parking lot was entirely peaceful. I parked my SUV in my reserved spot in the secure underground garage and took the private executive elevator up to the 42nd floor. The heavy glass doors of my private equity firm stood tall and imposing, overlooking the sprawling Atlanta skyline. I walked past the reception desk, giving a polite nod to my assistant, and headed straight into my corner office. I locked the thick oak door behind me, shutting out the noise of the corporate world. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked down at the city traffic below. Connor really thought he could intimidate me with loud words and aggressive posturing. He was a street-level con artist trying to play in a major league arena. He had no idea what I was capable of when I was sitting behind a keyboard. I walked over to my large mahogany desk and woke up my multi-monitor workstation. I had already secured my parents' mortgage debt, buying it out from the bank, but that second mortgage was only the tip of the iceberg. Connor had been living far too lavishly for a man whose tech company was failing. I needed to completely dismantle his entire financial ecosystem. I opened my specialized forensic accounting software, a program only available to top-tier financial investigators and government agencies. It was time to use the scalpel. I pulled up the court-mandated disclosures from his recent Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing. The documents were a mess of unpaid vendors, exaggerated revenue projections, and empty promises. But fraudsters like Connor always hide the real money in the blind spots. They use the failing company as a shield to distract from their personal theft. I began by cross-referencing the banking details Connor used for his startup with the personal financial records of my parents. Growing up, my father Winston and my mother Brenda had always been overly cautious with their savings. My father bragged for decades about his massive retirement nest egg. He constantly reminded everyone in our church community that he had an $800,000 portfolio sitting in a highly conservative index fund. He had worked for 30 years to build that security. I initiated a deep trace algorithm matching my parents' social security numbers to their primary banking nodes. I sat back and watched the loading bar scan through thousands of secure financial registries. When the results finally populated on my high-resolution screen, The sheer magnitude of my parents' foolishness hit me harder than I had anticipated. Their conservative index fund was completely empty. The balance read 0.00. I pulled the historical ledgers to see exactly what had happened. The history showed a series of massive liquidations that had started exactly 6 months ago, right around the time Connor started showing up to family events in brand new designer suits. The funds were not just casually transferred out. They were systematically withdrawn and wired in specific increments of $49,000. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly what that meant. Connor was using a technique called smurfing, trying to stay just under the $50,000 threshold that automatically triggers federal banking alerts for suspicious activity. I highlighted the routing numbers and traced the destination of every single wire transfer. The money did not go into any legitimate venture capital account or domestic investment portfolio. Instead, it was funneled directly into 3 separate shell companies, all registered at a single virtual office address in Delaware. I pulled the incorporation documents for those shell companies. All 3 of them listed Connor as the sole managing director, but the digital trail did not stop there. From Delaware, the money was rapidly converted into digital assets. Connor had taken my parents' $800,000 life savings and wired it directly into unregulated offshore crypto accounts based in the Cayman Islands and Malta. A chilling realization washed over me. Connor had pitched my parents an exclusive AI startup investment opportunity, promising them guaranteed returns and generational wealth. My father, standing at the church podium crying tears of joy, thought he was a savvy investor. But in reality, Connor was playing a high-stakes game of decentralized roulette with their money. He had stolen their entire future. I sat back in my leather ergonomic chair and just stared at the glowing rows of data. My parents had worked 3 decades for that money. My father had driven a worn-out sedan for 10 years just to save those funds. My mother had clipped coupons and strictly budgeted our groceries when we were children. Yet they willingly handed every single penny over to a smooth-talking white son-in-law because he promised them proximity to power and prestige. They trusted his skin color, his charming smile, and his rented Porsche more than they trusted their own daughter who managed billion-dollar portfolios for a living. I did not shed a single tear for them. My heart felt completely cold and detached. They had made their choice long ago when they decided Vanessa was the only daughter who mattered. But I was absolutely going to make sure Connor paid for his crimes. Financial fraud leaves a permanent digital fingerprint that can never be truly wiped clean no matter how many offshore crypto wallets you bounce the money through. I began downloading every single packet of data. I exported the offshore routing numbers, the blockchain transaction hashes, and the fake promissory notes Connor had forged to convince my parents his investment firm was legitimate. I spent the next 4 hours locked in my office meticulously organizing the evidence. I built a comprehensive timeline showing the exact dates my parents liquidated their retirement funds and cross-referenced those dates with Connor's personal spending habits. The correlation was undeniable. The day after my father wired the first $98,000, Connor paid off his country club initiation fees and bought Vanessa a $20,000 diamond tennis bracelet. He was literally funding Vanessa's lavish lifestyle using my parents' stolen retirement money, while my parents looked down on me for being a single mother. I printed the entire forensic dossier on thick, high-quality paper. Each page that slid out of the printer was another nail in his coffin. I gathered the heavy stack of documents and slipped them into a thick red manila folder. This was no longer just a family dispute over a restaurant bill or a petty argument in a parking lot. Wire fraud of this magnitude, especially targeting the elderly and utilizing offshore crypto accounts, crossed multiple federal lines. I opened a secure encrypted email channel on my secondary monitor. I had high-level contacts within the white-collar crime division of the FBI from previous corporate audits I had conducted. I drafted a highly detailed but completely objective message outlining the smurfing technique, the shell companies, and the offshore crypto wallets. I attached a sanitized executive summary of the transfers and formally requested an immediate review for a federal freeze on all of Connor's domestic assets. By the time I hit send, the sun was beginning to set over the city, casting a vibrant orange and purple glow across my office walls. My large wooden desk was perfectly clear, except for that thick red folder sitting right in the center. Connor thought he was the smartest person in every room he walked into. He thought he had successfully manipulated an entire family into giving him a golden parachute. He had no idea he had just handed a ruthless forensic accountant the exact evidence required to send him to federal prison for the next 2 decades. I took a sip of my cold black coffee and smiled into the quiet room. The trap was fully set, and there was absolutely no way out. The weekend passed with a quiet, heavy anticipation. Sunday morning arrived with a bright, deceptive sunlight streaming through my kitchen windows. My father, Winston, had explicitly texted me days ago banning me from stepping foot inside the church sanctuary until I offered a groveling apology to Connor. But knowing what I had just sent to the Federal Bureau of Investigation on Friday night, I felt no obligation to obey a man who was actively defending his own financial executioner. I dressed carefully, choosing a tailored charcoal suit that projected absolute authority. I arranged for my trusted nanny to take Elijah and Miles to the park for the morning. I did not want my sons exposed to the toxic theater that was about to unfold. The drive to the church was short, but my mind was racing, calculating the timelines of federal asset freezes. When I pulled into the sprawling parking lot of the fellowship congregation, I noticed my parents' immaculate sedan parked near the front entrance next to Connor's rented black Porsche. They always needed to be seen in the best spots. I walked through the heavy wooden double doors just as the choir was finishing the opening hymn. The sanctuary was packed with hundreds of community members dressed in their Sunday best. The ushers tried to guide me toward the front, but I shook my head and slipped into a wooden pew in the very back row. I wanted a clear view of the entire room. My parents were sitting in the front row. My mother, Brenda, was wearing a lavish custom-made hat, and my father was in his deacon robes looking incredibly proud. Vanessa sat right beside them, draped in a designer silk dress holding Connor's hand. Connor looked ridiculously smug, wearing a light gray suit that I knew was paid for with my parents' stolen retirement funds. The service proceeded with the usual prayers and offerings until it was time for the community announcements. This was the part of the service where the church leadership shared important news and celebrated the successes of the congregation. My father stepped up to the polished wooden podium. He adjusted his microphone and looked out over the crowd. His chest puffed out with a ridiculous amount of pride. He spoke about the importance of family and faith, and how God blesses those who walk the righteous path. Then his voice cracked and he wiped a theatrical tear from his eye. He told the entire church that he wanted to publicly testify about a profound blessing his family had received. He called Connor his God-sent son-in-law. He praised Connor for being a visionary leader and a selfless provider. My father actually choked up as he described how Connor had graciously stepped in to secure the financial future of the entire family. I sat perfectly still in the back row, listening to my father humiliate himself on a public stage. He was literally weeping with gratitude for the man who was currently laundering his life savings through offshore crypto accounts. The tragic irony of the situation made my blood run absolutely cold. But the worst was yet to come. My father gestured for Connor to join him at the podium. The congregation offered a warm murmur of approval as Connor confidently walked up the steps, adjusting his tie and offering a humble smile that I knew was completely rehearsed. Connor took the microphone from my father and looked out at the sea of faces. He spoke with the smooth, practiced cadence of a seasoned con artist. He thanked my father for the kind words and talked about how much he loved this community. Then he dropped the bombshell. He proudly announced to the church that he had just helped Winston and Brenda take out a $500,000 second mortgage on their fully paid-off home. He spun it as a brilliant strategic investment. He claimed he was placing the equity of their house into a highly exclusive tier of his artificial intelligence startup. He boldly promised the congregation that this strategic move would double my parents' wealth in exactly 6 months, allowing them to retire in absolute luxury and donate a massive sum to the church building fund. The sanctuary erupted into thunderous applause. Church members were standing up clapping and cheering for my parents and their brilliant white savior son-in-law. My mother was beaming, waving at her friends in the surrounding pews. Vanessa looked back at the crowd, her face glowing with unearned superiority. They were all completely blinded by the illusion of wealth and prestige. My hands gripped the edge of the wooden pew in front of me so tightly my knuckles turned white. The $800,000 retirement fund was already gone, and now they had literally signed over the roof over their heads. Connor had convinced them to leverage their only remaining asset just to feed his collapsing Ponzi scheme. A second mortgage meant the bank had a direct lien on their property. If the payments bounced, the bank would foreclose, and my parents would be thrown out onto the street. Connor was not just stealing their money. He was actively destroying their physical shelter, while making them thank him for it in front of hundreds of people. As the applause began to die down, Connor looked across the massive room. His eyes scanned the back rows and locked directly onto mine. His confident smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. He saw me sitting there in my dark suit, staring back at him with zero emotion. He knew I understood exactly what a second mortgage meant for a company facing Chapter 11 bankruptcy. He knew I saw right through his charade. But instead of showing fear, he quickly regained his composure and offered me a small, arrogant smirk before turning back to hug my father. He thought he had won. He thought that by getting my parents to publicly announce the financial move, he had trapped me into silence. He assumed that exposing him now would mean publicly humiliating my parents in front of their beloved church community, and that I would never be cruel enough to do that to my own flesh and blood. He was banking on my empathy to protect his fraud. But Connor made one fatal miscalculation. He assumed I still cared about protecting the reputation of people who had spent my entire life making me feel worthless. I watched them celebrate their own financial ruin and realized I did not feel an ounce of pity. The FBI already had the wire fraud evidence, but federal investigations take months to execute. I could not wait for the government to move while Connor drained this new $500,000 mortgage payout. I needed to intercept that debt immediately. I stood up from the pew before the choir could start the closing song and walked quietly out the back doors into the bright morning sun. My plan was no longer just about exposing a criminal, it was about becoming the absolute master of my parents' fate. Later that afternoon, the intense Atlanta heat settled over my parents' neighborhood as they hosted their celebratory post-service barbecue. I had not been officially invited, but the gate to the backyard was wide open and church members were spilling out onto the driveway. The smell of smoked brisket and sweet barbecue sauce filled the heavy, humid air, mingling with the sound of loud laughter and gospel music playing from a portable speaker. I parked my SUV a block away under the shade of a large oak tree and walked toward the house, feeling a strange sense of absolute calm wash over me. The front yard was lined with luxury vehicles, including Connor's. Ridiculous rented black Porsche parked directly on the pristine grass as if he owned the entire block. I walked straight down the side path, my heels clicking softly against the concrete, and entered the backyard. The scene unfolding before me was exactly what I expected. It was a theater of fake wealth and blind loyalty. My mother Brenda was holding court near the patio table, showing off a new diamond pendant to the other church ladies, boasting about her early retirement plans. Vanessa was lounging on a padded patio chair, wearing an oversized designer sun hat and sipping a bright orange mimosa, acting like she was the undisputed queen of the neighborhood. In the very center of the yard, standing next to my father's prized custom brick grill, was Connor. He had taken off his expensive suit jacket and rolled up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt, holding a craft beer in one hand and a pair of metal tongs in the other. He was loudly bragging to a group of older men about venture capital algorithms and artificial intelligence, using complex buzzwords he clearly did not understand. My father, Winston, stood right next to him, nodding eagerly along with every single word, looking at his white son-in-law with pure, undisguised adoration. I quietly walked over to the long buffet table set up against the side of the house. I picked up a sturdy paper plate and scooped a generous portion of my aunt's famous mustard potato salad. I picked up a plastic fork and took a slow, deliberate bite, letting the cool tang settle on my tongue. I stood there in the shade of the patio awning for several minutes, just observing their pathetic display. Nobody had noticed me yet. They were too captivated by the lies pouring out of Connor's mouth. After finishing my second bite, I slowly made my way across the manicured lawn, stepping carefully to keep my balance. The joyful chatter of the party began to rapidly die down as people finally saw me approaching. My mother stopped talking mid-sentence, her hand dropping from her necklace as her fake smile instantly vanished. Vanessa lowered her designer sunglasses and glared at me, her posture stiffening defensively. But I did not look at them. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Connor. I walked right up to the edge of his tight circle of admirers, stopping just a few feet away from the hot grill. Connor stopped talking mid-sentence. He tried to offer me a condescending smile, but his blue eyes betrayed a sudden flash of genuine panic. He asked me what I was doing there, telling the crowd he thought I went home to feed my kids some fast food. I took another slow bite of my potato salad, swallowed deliberately, and looked him dead in the eye. I told him I just had a few simple professional questions about his brilliant new investment strategy since my parents were risking their entire home on it. The older churchmen looked back and forth between us, sensing the sudden freezing drop in the atmosphere. I asked my first question, without raising my voice. I asked him to explain the specific tax liabilities associated with a second mortgage cash-out, when the primary borrowers are over the age of 65. I asked him exactly how he planned to offset the massive capital gains impact on their fixed income status. Connor blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He tried to nervously laugh it off, telling the men that his accounting team handles the boring paperwork and that I was just trying to sound smart. I did not let him breathe or recover. I immediately stepped closer and asked my second question. I asked him to detail the exact mortgage disbursement clauses and requested the name of the regulated escrow account, where the $500,000 was currently sitting while awaiting deployment into his startup. A heavy bead of sweat rolled down the side of his temple. He shifted his weight nervously, spilling a few drops of his amber beer onto the green grass. He stammered something vague about proprietary holding accounts and strict non-disclosure agreements. I smiled a completely cold, dead smile and hit him with the third and final question. I asked him how a tech company that had officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection exactly 3 days ago was legally permitted to solicit unregistered securities from unaccredited elderly investors without triggering an immediate investigation by the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission. The silence that fell over the entire backyard was absolute and suffocating. You could hear the hot charcoal popping loudly inside the grill. Connor's face went from pale gray to bright crimson in a matter of seconds. His charming tech bro facade completely shattered into a million pieces. He panicked. He threw his plastic cup violently onto the ground and lunged a step toward me, his voice cracking as he began to yell. He told me I was a miserable, jealous failure who was obsessed with ruining his life because I could not hold on to a man of my own. He called me a pathetic single mother who spent her lonely days crunching numbers in a cubicle because she had no real ambition or vision for the future. He was practically spitting as he hurled the vicious insults, trying desperately to regain his lost dominance in front of the church congregation. Before I could even open my mouth to respond, my father pushed his way violently through the silent crowd. His face was contorted with an ugly, familiar rage. He did not look at the sweating, desperate man who was actively robbing him blind. Instead, he looked at me, the only daughter who was trying to show him the ugly truth. My father raised his hand and pointed a trembling, furious finger directly toward the wooden side gate. He screamed at me, his deep voice echoing loudly off the surrounding brick houses. He told me I was a bitter and toxic woman who carried poison in her heart. He said I was intentionally cursing the family blessing because my soul was consumed with envy. He ordered me to get off his property immediately and told the entire crowd that I was no longer welcome in his home until I learned to respect my betters. I stood there perfectly still, holding my cheap paper plate, looking at the absolute unshakable conviction in my father's angry eyes. He had made his ultimate choice. They all had. Vanessa was smirking triumphantly from her patio chair, and my mother was shaking her head in dramatic disgust. I did not argue with him. I did not cry or try to explain the federal fraud forms I had already submitted to the government. I just smiled. It was a genuine warm smile of pure emotional release. The invisible chains they had wrapped around my neck for 34 years simply snapped and fell away. I walked over to the large plastic trash can near the patio doors, dropped my half-eaten plate of potato salad inside, and turned my back on them forever. I walked slowly out of the gate with my head held high, stepping back out onto the quiet street, knowing the countdown to their total financial destruction had officially begun. The drive away from my parents' house was the most liberating experience of my entire life. I did not feel a single ounce of regret or sadness as I navigated the familiar Atlanta streets back to my own home. My father had kicked me out of the very house that was currently being ripped out from under his feet by the man he was desperately defending. I spent the rest of my Sunday evening playing board games with Elijah and Miles, completely detached from the toxic drama unfolding miles away. My phone remained silent. I had already blocked my parents and Vanessa. They made their bed, and now they were going to lose it entirely. Monday morning arrived, and I was at my office desk before the sun even fully crested over the city skyline. I had already sent the FBI the evidence regarding the initial $800,000 retirement fund theft. But this new $500,000 second mortgage was a completely different beast. If I just called the local police or let the federal investigation take its slow, bureaucratic course, Connor would eventually be arrested, but the collateral damage would be catastrophic for the property itself. The bank that issued the second mortgage did not care about family dynamics or white-collar fraud. The moment Connor's shell companies defaulted on the monthly payments, which they inevitably would, since the money was already gone, the bank would initiate foreclosure proceedings. My parents would be evicted by soulless bank executives, and the house would be auctioned off to the highest bidder. I could not let a random corporate bank take that satisfaction. I wanted to hold the strings. I wanted to be the one who decided their fate. I picked up my office phone and dialed the direct line to the regional director of commercial lending at Southern Heritage Bank. My private equity firm managed over $2 billion in assets, and Southern Heritage was one of our primary banking partners. The director answered on the second ring, his voice overly eager to please a major client. We exchanged brief pleasantries before I got straight to the point. I told him I was looking at a highly specific piece of distressed residential debt that his branch had just underwritten a few days ago. I read off my parents' address and the exact loan origination number I had pulled from the public county records over the weekend. The director sounded confused for a moment. He pulled up the file and noted that the loan was brand new and had not even entered the first billing cycle yet, so it technically was not distressed. I kept my voice perfectly level and professional. I told him that my firm had proprietary algorithmic risk assessments indicating the primary guarantor of that specific loan was about to face catastrophic insolvency. I offered to buy the paper right then and there. In the banking world, buying a mortgage note on the secondary market is a common practice to offload risk. Banks love liquidity, especially when a massive private equity partner is offering to buy a slightly risky loan at full face value plus a premium handling fee. He hesitated for only a second before agreeing. The transaction was set in motion. I used a subsidiary holding company fully controlled by my firm, so my name would not appear on any of the initial transfer documents. My legal team drafted the purchase agreement within the hour. By lunchtime, the documents were sitting in my inbox, waiting for my digital signature. I sat in my quiet office staring at the contract on my monitor. Purchasing this debt meant I was legally assuming all the rights of the original lender. The deed of trust was being assigned directly to my holding company. If the monthly payments were missed, I was the one who had the legal authority to issue the notice of default. I was the one who could initiate foreclosure. I was essentially becoming my parents' landlord and their ultimate creditor. The sheer irony of the situation was intoxicating. Less than 24 hours ago, my father stood on his manicured lawn and banished me from his property, telling me I had no place in his successful family. He had absolutely no idea that his ungrateful daughter was currently buying the very grass he was standing on. I clicked the mouse and applied my digital signature to the purchase agreement. I authorized the wire transfer of $510,000 from my firm's acquisition fund directly to Southern Heritage Bank. Within minutes, I received the confirmation receipt. The transaction was complete, and the title assignment was being recorded with the county clerk's office. I printed the final confirmation pages and the assigned deed of trust. The paper felt heavy in my hands. I walked over to the hidden wall safe behind the abstract painting in my office. I entered the passcode, heard the heavy steel click, and placed the documents inside, right next to the red folder containing Connor's federal wire fraud evidence. I closed the safe and spun the dial, locking away the financial equivalent of a nuclear bomb. Connor was currently running around Atlanta, spending the stolen mortgage money thinking he was untouchable. My parents were probably busy planning their luxury European vacation funded by their imaginary investment returns. Vanessa was likely bragging to her country club friends about her brilliant husband. They were all living in a fragile glass house built entirely on lies and deceit. I walked back to my desk and looked out at the sprawling city. The predator in me was fully awakened and completely satisfied. I did not need to scream or yell or throw tantrums like Vanessa did. I did not need to desperately seek validation from a church congregation like my father. True power was completely silent. True power was holding the deed to the kingdom, while the fake king was still busy admiring his rented crown. All I had to do now was wait for the very first mortgage payment to bounce. And knowing Connor's severe liquidity crisis, I knew I would not have to wait very long. The trap was set, the steel jaws were locked, and I was holding the only key. 2 weeks passed since I locked the deed to my parents' house inside my office safe. 14 days of absolute silence from my family. I focused on my work, and my boys enjoying the quiet peace that came with finally cutting the toxic cord. I knew my parents were living in a state of blissful ignorance, spending money they thought they had on premium credit cards they thought they could easily pay off once Connor's imaginary startup returns started rolling in. My mother Brenda had always been a prolific spender when she felt financially secure, but her arrogance was about to crash headfirst into reality. It happened on a warm Wednesday afternoon during the annual Women of Faith charity luncheon. It was the most prestigious social event on my mother's calendar. All the wealthy wives and influential women of the church gathered at the downtown Ritz-Carlton to bid on luxury items and donate massive sums to the community building fund. My mother had been bragging for weeks about her new investment wealth, telling anyone who would listen that her son-in-law was a tech genius making them millions. According to the frantic voicemails I would later receive, she confidently marched up to the silent auction table and placed a winning bid of $15,000 for an exclusive vacation package to the Amalfi Coast. She wanted everyone in that grand ballroom to see how rich and blessed she was. When the charity treasurer ran her premium platinum credit card, the machine beeped a harsh metallic error. Declined. My mother laughed it off, waving her manicured hand and telling the treasurer it must be a simple fraud alert because she was spending so generously lately. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out a second card associated with a completely different bank. She handed it over with a confident smile, acting as if it was just a minor inconvenience. The machine processed for a few agonizing seconds before beeping again. Declined. The smug smile froze on her face as the women standing around her began to whisper and exchange knowing glances. The treasurer politely asked if she had another form of payment because the terminal indicated that both accounts were completely maxed out and frozen for insufficient funds. My mother, humiliated and panicking, tried to log into her banking app on her phone, only to find herself locked out entirely due to massive overdraft penalties. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a quarterly portfolio report when my private cell phone started vibrating. The caller ID flashed an unknown local office line, but I recognized the frantic, heavy breathing the second I picked up. It was Vanessa. I had blocked her personal number, but she was calling me from a random phone at the country club. I pressed the receiver to my ear without saying a word. Vanessa's voice exploded through the speaker, shrill and completely hysterical. She was screaming at the top of her lungs, accusing me of committing a federal cybercrime. She yelled that our mother was currently locked in a bathroom stall at the Ritz-Carlton, having a severe panic attack because every single one of her bank accounts was frozen, and her credit cards were bouncing all over the city. Vanessa did not hold back her vitriol. She accused me of hacking into my parents' financial portals out of pure jealousy and spite. She said that because I was a forensic accountant, I obviously used my technical skills to freeze their assets just to embarrass our mother in front of her high society church friends. Vanessa demanded that I reverse the hack immediately, or she would call the police and have me arrested for cyber terrorism. She said I was a pathetic monster who could not stand seeing my family succeed, while I sat alone in my sad little office. She even brought my children into it, claiming I was setting a terrible example for my boys by being such a bitter and vindictive daughter. I let her scream. I listened to her breathless, frantic accusations while looking out at the calm city skyline. I did not raise my voice or interrupt her temper tantrum. When she finally stopped to take a breath, demanding an immediate answer, I spoke very quietly. I told Vanessa that I did not touch their bank accounts and I did not freeze their credit cards. I explained to her in a slow, professional tone that credit card companies automatically freeze accounts when the connected checking accounts fall into a severe negative balance and the automated payments begin to bounce. Vanessa scoffed loudly, calling me a liar. She said Connor had deposited $500,000 from the second mortgage into their primary account just 2 weeks ago, so there was absolutely no way they had a negative balance. I took a sip of my black coffee and delivered the brutal reality check she was completely unprepared for. I told Vanessa that the $500,000 never hit my parents' checking account. It was never deposited into any legitimate escrow fund or family trust account. I told her that Connor's precious tech startup was a sinking ship, drowning in massive, unregulated debt. The truth was that Connor owed very dangerous people a lot of money. He had used the $500,000 mortgage cash out to pay off aggressive loan sharks and unregulated offshore lenders who were threatening to destroy him. The money was gone the exact second the bank released the funds. He routed it through a Delaware shell company and wired it directly to his creditors, leaving my parents holding an empty bag and a massive monthly mortgage payment they could never afford on their fixed income. Vanessa went completely silent on the other end of the line. The heavy, frantic breathing stopped. For a brief moment, I thought she had dropped the phone. Then the deep denial kicked in. It is the first stage of grief when a golden child realizes their perfect life is built entirely on a mountain of lies. She started stammering, telling me I was making it all up because I was desperately trying to destroy her marriage. She said Connor was a brilliant CEO and that the money was safely tied up in proprietary artificial intelligence algorithms that I was simply too stupid to understand. She told me I was a sick and twisted person for inventing such a horrible story just to scare her. I did not try to convince her. I did not offer any further proof or try to comfort my hysterical sister. She had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself, and I had no desire to cushion her inevitable fall. I simply told her that the very first monthly payment for the new second mortgage was due in exactly 3 days. I suggested she tell her brilliant husband to check the mail because the notices of default were already printed and ready to be sent to the property. I ended the call and placed the phone face down on my smooth wooden desk. The beautiful illusion they had all worked so hard to maintain was finally shattering into pieces, and the collateral damage was entirely their own fault. The sun had long since dipped below the Atlanta skyline, leaving my office bathed in the cool blue glow of my monitors and the distant streetlights. It was past 8 in the evening, and the private equity firm was entirely deserted. The administrative staff had gone home hours ago, and the heavy glass doors of the executive suite were locked for the night. I was sitting at my desk reviewing the final default notices that were scheduled to be mailed to my parents' house in the morning. The quiet hum of the air conditioning was the only sound in the room. I was not afraid of being alone in the building. Security was incredibly tight on the ground floor, requiring keycard access to even operate the elevators. That was why the sudden, violent slamming of my heavy oak office door swinging open sent a brief spike of adrenaline through my chest. Connor stood in the doorway. He looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant tech CEO who had mocked my children at the steakhouse just a few weeks prior. His expensive custom suit was severely wrinkled and stained. His tie was missing, and the top 3 buttons of his shirt were ripped open, exposing a red, flushed chest. His hair was matted with sweat, and his eyes were completely bloodshot, carrying the wild, frantic look of a cornered animal. He quickly stepped inside and shoved the heavy wooden door shut behind him, engaging the deadbolt with a loud metallic click. He had somehow managed to tailgate a late-working executive through the lobby security barriers and stalked his way up to my floor. He stood there for a second, breathing heavily, the smell of stale whiskey and sheer panic radiating across the room. I did not scream or press the panic button under my desk. I maintained absolute stillness, keeping my hands resting lightly on my keyboard. I calmly slid my right hand over to my cell phone, which was resting face up next to my coffee mug. With a subtle tap of my thumb, I opened the voice memo app and hit the red record button. Connor began marching toward my desk, his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet office. He slammed both of his hands down onto the polished mahogany surface, leaning over so far that his face was only inches from mine. He started screaming at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking under the intense strain. He demanded to know what I had done to his bank accounts. He accused me of hacking his corporate infrastructure and illegally freezing his routing numbers. He yelled that his offshore lenders were threatening to kill him, and that he could not access a single penny of the $500,000 he had taken from my parents. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, putting a few inches of distance between his whiskey-soaked breath and my face. I told him in a flat, emotionless voice that I had absolutely nothing to do with his banking errors. I explained that when you bounce massive wire transfers through unregulated shell companies, federal banking algorithms automatically flag and freeze the accounts for suspected money laundering. He did not want to hear logic. He was drowning and looking for someone to drag down with him. He reached across the desk and violently swept my coffee mug and a stack of files onto the floor. The ceramic mug shattered into pieces, splashing cold coffee across the expensive rug. He pointed a trembling finger right between my eyes and began making violent threats. He told me I was just a pathetic little accountant who had no idea how the real world worked. He threatened to hire the most vicious corporate defense lawyers in the city to sue me into oblivion for corporate espionage and defamation. He said he would take my house, my firm, and the custody of my children. When I did not flinch or react to his legal threats, the desperation in his eyes shifted into something much darker and physically dangerous. He walked around the edge of my desk, balling his hands into tight fists. He leaned down, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper. He told me I was completely alone in this empty building and that I needed to reverse the holds on his accounts right now, or he was going to make sure I never walked out of this office again. He was trying to use physical intimidation to force a financial miracle that I could not grant even if I wanted to. I looked up at this pathetic man who had built his entire identity on the oppression and manipulation of women. He was used to Vanessa cowering and apologizing. He was used to my mother bowing to his every whim. He expected me to break down crying and beg for mercy. Instead, I reached out and firmly grasped the edge of my massive curved computer monitor. I swiveled the screen around so it was facing him directly. The bright white background of the document illuminated his sweaty, terrified face. I told him he was threatening the wrong person. I told him to read the header of the document currently displayed on the screen. Connor squinted his bloodshot eyes trying to focus on the text. It was the official copy of the Federal Bureau of Investigation wire fraud complaint that I had submitted 2 weeks ago. His eyes rapidly scanned down the page, darting back and forth as he read his own shell company names, his offshore crypto wallet addresses, and the exact dates and times he had transferred my parents' stolen retirement funds. He saw the formal request for a comprehensive asset freeze and the recommendation for immediate criminal prosecution under the Federal Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act. I spoke slowly, making sure every single word pierced through his drunken panic. I told him that I did not freeze his credit cards. The federal government did. I told him that the FBI had been monitoring his communications and financial movements since the moment I handed them the digital breadcrumbs. I looked at his clenched fists and told him that assaulting me in this office would simply add federal battery and witness intimidation to his rapidly growing list of felony charges. All the violent energy completely drained out of his body. The false bravado, the arrogance, the physical intimidation, it all vanished in a fraction of a second. His face turned a sickening shade of ash gray. His hands began to shake so violently he had to grab the edge of my desk just to stay standing. He looked at the shattered coffee mug on the floor and then back at the glowing monitor. The reality of federal prison was staring him right in the face, and he knew there was no way to smooth talk his way out of a forensic financial paper trail. Connor stumbled backwards, tripping over his own expensive shoes. He did not say another word. He turned around and practically ran toward the heavy oak door, his hands frantically fumbling with the deadbolt. He ripped the door open and bolted down the hallway, sprinting toward the emergency stairwell. I listened to his panicked footsteps echoing away until the heavy fire door slammed shut, plunging the floor back into total silence. I calmly reached over to my phone and stopped the voice recording, saving the audio file to my secure cloud server. The audio of his physical threats and his admission of possessing the $500,000 would be an excellent addition to the federal prosecutor's evidence file. I stood up, grabbed a paper towel from the break room, and carefully wiped the spilled coffee off my rug. Connor was officially a man on the run with no money, no resources, and a federal target on his back. The trap had completely snapped shut. There was only one place left for this all to end, and I was going to make sure the entire family had front row seats to the finale. The morning sun broke through the heavy clouds, casting a harsh, bright light across the city. I did not go straight to my office that morning. Instead, I drove my SUV to the financial district, pulling into the secure underground parking garage of the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in Atlanta. My lead attorney, Diane, was waiting for me in her glass-walled conference room. Diane was a brilliant legal mind, a black woman who had fought her way to the top of a male-dominated industry, and she did not tolerate fools or fraudsters. I walked into the quiet room and placed my laptop and the heavy red folder on the polished marble table. I also placed a silver USB drive next to the folder. I told Diane about my late-night visitor. I played the audio recording of Connor breaking into my office, making physical threats, and openly admitting that he could not access the $500,000 he stole from my parents. Diane listened with a perfectly neutral expression, but I could see the predatory gleam in her dark eyes. When the recording ended, she simply nodded and said, "This makes my job significantly easier." She opened her leather briefcase and pulled out two thick stacks of legal documents, placing them deliberately on the table in front of me. The crisp white paper looked heavy, carrying the weight of absolute destruction. Diane slid the first stack toward me. It was the finalized sworn affidavit and the official wire fraud report, ready to be formally submitted to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She explained that by signing this document, I was officially triggering the federal subpoenas. The FBI would immediately freeze whatever hidden accounts Connor still had access to, and they would begin seizing his physical assets. She warned me that once my signature was on that paper, there was no turning back. Connor would be facing serious federal prison time, and my family would be dragged into the public spotlight as the victims of a humiliating financial scam. I picked up the heavy gold pen resting on the table. I did not hesitate for a single second. I thought about my father throwing paper napkins at my children. I thought about my mother blindly defending a man who was robbing her. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my full name in smooth, dark ink. The first domino was officially pushed. Then Diane slid the second stack of papers across the marble table. This one felt entirely different. It was deeply personal. It was a formal notice of default and a legal eviction notice. Diane looked at me carefully, asking if I was absolutely sure I wanted to proceed with this step. She reminded me that because my private equity holding company owned the debt, we had the legal right to seize the property the moment the first payment bounced. Midnight had passed, and the grace period was officially over. My parents' checking accounts were frozen, and the $500,000 mortgage payment had failed to clear. They were legally in breach of contract. I looked down at the legal description of the property. It was the 4-bedroom house I grew up in. It was the house where I was constantly told I was not good enough. It was the house where my college fund was stolen to buy Vanessa a luxury car. It was the house I was kicked out of just weeks ago for daring to ask questions about the very loan that was now causing its foreclosure. Society tells us that family is sacred and that blood should excuse all sins. But blood does not pay a $500,000 commercial debt. Blood does not repair decades of emotional abuse. I held the gold pen tightly in my fingers. I told Diane that I was more sure of this than anything else in my entire life. I signed the notice of default, and then I signed the formal eviction order. The strokes of the pen felt like cutting away a massive infected wound. The house no longer belonged to Winston and Brenda. Legally and practically, it belonged to me. I was their landlord and their creditor. Diane organized the papers, slipping the federal documents into an envelope for the courier. She asked me if I wanted her to send the county sheriff to serve the eviction notice to my parents' residence that afternoon. She said the standard procedure was to post the bright yellow notice on the front door for the entire neighborhood to see. It would be a humiliating public spectacle, exactly what my parents feared most. I shook my head slowly. I told Diane to hold off on the sheriff. I did not want a random police officer handling this. My parents had spent their entire lives putting on a show for their church community, and they had an incredibly important performance coming up this very weekend. It was their 40th wedding anniversary, and they had rented out the lavish banquet hall at their church to celebrate their perfect marriage and their newly acquired imaginary wealth. Vanessa had been bragging about the expensive catered gala for months. My father was planning to give another long speech about his blessings. Connor would undoubtedly try to put on a brave face, pretending his world was not actively collapsing around him. I reached across the table and picked up the signed eviction notice, carefully folding it and slipping it into my designer handbag. I looked at Diane and told her that I would be serving the eviction notice myself. I wanted to look my father in the eye when he realized the daughter he treated like garbage was the only reason he even had a roof over his head. I wanted to watch Vanessa realize her white savior husband was a penniless criminal. Diane offered a rare small smile, recognizing the poetic justice in my plan. She told me to call her when the dust settled. I left the law firm and stepped back out into the bright morning sun. The legal mechanisms were fully engaged and running quietly in the background. Connor was living on borrowed time, and my parents were living in a house they no longer owned. The stage for their grand anniversary gala was set, but I was bringing a script they could never have anticipated. The weekend of the 40th anniversary gala arrived with a suffocating humidity that hung over Atlanta like a heavy blanket. I spent the morning with my boys, dropping them off at a weekend science camp they had been begging to attend. I wanted them far away from the toxic blast radius of what was about to happen. I returned to my quiet house and prepared for the evening. I did not choose a flashy evening gown or heavy makeup. I chose a sharply tailored midnight blue suit that fit like armor. I slipped my black leather heels on and carefully placed the thick red manila folder containing Connor's federal wire fraud documents and the signed eviction notice into my structured leather tote bag. When I pulled into the massive parking lot of the Fellowship Church, the sun was just beginning to set. The lot was packed with luxury vehicles. My parents had spared absolutely no expense for this party, using premium credit cards they thought they could easily pay off with Connor's imaginary tech millions. They had rented out the grand banquet hall, which was a massive space, usually reserved for high society weddings. As I walked through the heavy glass double doors, the sheer scale of their financial delusion hit me. The room was transformed into a sickening display of fake opulence. Massive floral centerpieces of white roses and imported orchids sat on every table. Crystal chandeliers had been rented and hung from the ceiling beams, casting a warm golden light over the hundreds of church members dressed in their finest evening wear. There was a live jazz band playing softly in the corner, and waiters in crisp white shirts were circulating with silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres. It was a monument to their ego built entirely on a foundation of stolen money and unpaid debt. The church ladies were wearing their most extravagant hats, and the deacons were sipping sparkling cider, acting as if they had all ascended to the upper echelons of Atlanta high society simply by association. I stood near the entrance, taking in the scene. At the front of the room, sitting at a long head table draped in gold silk, were my parents. My mother, Brenda, was wearing a custom beaded gown that probably cost more than her first car. She was laughing and touching the arms of the church elders, completely oblivious to the fact that her bank accounts were frozen and her premium credit cards had been cut off. My father, Winston, sat beside her looking like a proud king holding court, and standing at the main microphone on the raised stage holding a glass of champagne was Connor. He looked terrible. Beneath the dim atmospheric lighting, I could see the deep dark bags under his eyes, and the tense, rigid way he held his shoulders. His suit was slightly rumpled, completely lacking the crisp confidence he usually projected. He was sweating profusely, dabbing his forehead with a cloth napkin between sentences. But despite his internal terror, he was putting on the performance of a lifetime. He was delivering a toast about family loyalty. He spoke into the microphone, his voice echoing across the silent, captivated room. He talked about how family is the ultimate anchor in a stormy world. He praised my father for his wisdom and my mother for her unconditional love. He actually had the audacity to talk about sacrifice and honor while he stood there knowing he had bankrupted the very people he was toasting. As the crowd murmured in polite agreement, Vanessa suddenly spotted me standing by the entrance. She was seated near the stage, but the moment she saw me, she practically leapt out of her chair. She marched across the banquet hall, her heels clicking loudly against the polished hardwood floor. She was wearing a heavily sequined champagne-colored dress that I knew for a fact cost over $3,000 because she had accidentally forwarded the receipt to the family group chat weeks ago. Vanessa stopped right in front of me, blocking my path into the room. Her eyes scanned my tailored suit with blatant disgust. She leaned in close, her voice a venomous whisper meant only for me. She asked me what I was doing here. She told me I had a lot of nerve showing my face after the horrible lies I had made up about her husband. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest and told me that I was underdressed and embarrassing. She said this was an exclusive high society event and that my boring corporate outfit was ruining the aesthetic of the family photos. I simply looked at her, letting her hurl her petty insults. Her entire world was about to collapse, and she was worried about the aesthetic of a dress. She grabbed my arm and tried to pull me toward a small, dimly lit table in the very back corner of the room, right next to the swinging kitchen doors. She told me that if I insisted on staying, I needed to sit in the back where nobody could see me and keep my mouth completely shut. She said Connor was giving a very important speech about their new investment wealth, and she did not want my bitter energy ruining their special night. I looked down at her hand gripping my sleeve. I did not pull away. I just stared at her fingers until she felt the freezing weight of my silence and slowly let go. Connor was still on stage rambling about building a legacy of generational wealth. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. I reached into my structured tote bag and wrapped my fingers around the smooth edge of the red manila folder. I looked Vanessa directly in the eyes. I offered her a calm, completely terrifying smile. I spoke softly, but with an absolute authority that made her physically step back. I told her I would not be sitting in the back corner. I told her I was not here to eat the catered food or take family pictures. I brushed past her shoulder, walking with slow, deliberate purpose down the center aisle of the banquet hall. Vanessa gasped, demanding to know where I thought I was going. I did not look back at her. I just kept my eyes locked on the sweating, terrified face of her husband, standing on the raised platform. I simply said, "No, I am going to the stage." Connor saw me approaching and his voice completely died in his throat mid-sentence. The microphone picked up his sharp, shaky intake of breath, broadcasting his sudden panic to the entire room. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium so hard his knuckles turned stark white. The hundreds of guests slowly turned their heads, following his terrified gaze down the center aisle. The jazz band, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, abruptly stopped playing. The room fell into a dead, heavy silence. The only sound left in the massive banquet hall was the steady, rhythmic click of my black leather heels against the hardwood floor. My mother Brenda stood up from her chair at the head table, a look of confusion and anger crossing her face. My father Winston lowered his glass, his jaw tightening. They thought I was here to cause a petty family scene. They had no idea I was carrying the legal destruction of their entire lives in my bag. The show was finally over and the reckoning had arrived. I reached the steps of the stage and walked up without breaking eye contact with Connor. He took a step back, his expensive shoes squeaking slightly on the polished wood. He reached out a shaking hand, as if to physically stop me, but he was paralyzed by the sheer weight of the silence in the room. I walked right past him and calmly took the microphone from his sweaty grip. The feedback whined for a brief second before settling. I looked over to the side of the stage where a laptop was set up to play the anniversary photo slideshow. I pulled the silver flash drive from my pocket and slid it smoothly into the USB port. I clicked the mouse and the giant projector screen behind Connor flickered. The loop of happy family photos vanished. In its place, a stark white legal document appeared magnified for the entire congregation to see. The bold black letters at the top were impossible to misread. It was a formal repossession order from a high-end luxury rental agency. I raised the microphone to my lips, my voice completely steady and cold. I welcomed the guests and apologized for interrupting the lovely toast. I told the crowd that since Connor was standing up here talking so passionately about family loyalty and building generational wealth, I thought it would be appropriate to share exactly what he had been building. I pointed to the massive screen behind him. I told the church community that the beautiful black Porsche Connor parked on the front lawn every Sunday was not a symbol of his tech success. It was a daily rental, and the document on the screen was a court-ordered repo mandate because his credit cards had bounced for the last 2 months. A collective gasp rippled through the banquet hall. I saw the senior pastor drop his fork onto his porcelain plate with a loud clatter. Vanessa let out a sharp cry from the floor, rushing toward the stage. but freezing at the bottom of the steps. She yelled that I was lying and that the document was a fake. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I just clicked the mouse again. The screen transitioned to a new document. This one carried the official seal of the United States Federal Bankruptcy Court. I explained to the sea of shocked faces that Connor's brilliant artificial intelligence startup, the one my father had been bragging about to every single person in this room, was nothing more than an empty shell. I read the Chapter 11 filing date out loud, proving that he had declared his company legally insolvent just days before he stood at the church podium and pitched it as a guaranteed investment. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, turning into a low rumble of outrage. The deacons who had looked at Connor with such admiration just an hour ago were now staring at him with pure disgust. They realized the man who had been lecturing them on financial freedom was completely broke. Connor was breathing so heavily he looked like he was about to pass out. He lunged toward the laptop, trying to pull the flash drive out, but I simply stepped in front of the table, blocking his path. I told him to stand completely still and let the congregation see the truth. My father, Winston, was gripping the edge of the head table, his knuckles white, his face a mask of absolute horror. He yelled up at the stage, demanding to know what was going on. He asked Connor to explain the documents, to tell them it was all a big misunderstanding. Connor just shook his head, tears of panic welling in his bloodshot eyes, unable to form a single coherent sentence. The silence from Connor was the loudest confession he could have ever made. I clicked the mouse for the third time, bringing up the final and most devastating piece of evidence. The screen filled with a complex forensic accounting flowchart that I had designed specifically for this moment. It showed a timeline starting with my parents' names and the $500,000 second mortgage they had taken out on their fully paid-off home. The red arrows tracked the money leaving the bank, entering Connor's domestic accounts, and immediately scattering into unregulated offshore crypto wallets and offshore loan shark accounts. I looked directly down at my father and my mother. I told them in front of all their high society friends that their golden son-in-law did not invest their money. I told them he gambled it all away to pay off dangerous debts because his fake tech empire collapsed months ago. I told the entire room that the second mortgage cash out was stolen the very second it was approved. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The illusion of the wealthy, successful white savior was completely shattered, leaving only the pathetic reality of a desperate thief. The man they thought was elevating their social status was actually digging their financial grave. Church members started standing up from their tables, pointing and whispering loudly. The shame that my parents had always tried to avoid, the public humiliation they feared more than anything else in the world, was crashing down on them in real time under the bright chandelier lights. My mother Brenda covered her face with her hands, letting out a loud sobbing wail that echoed through the banquet hall. She rocked back and forth in her chair, her custom beaded gown suddenly looking like a tragic costume. Vanessa was standing at the bottom of the stage steps, looking back and forth between the massive projector screen and her sweating husband. She finally realized that her designer dresses, her country club lunches, and her entire identity were funded by the systematic financial abuse of her own parents. She dropped her expensive clutch onto the floor, the metal clasp echoing in the tense room. Connor finally found his voice. It was a pathetic, high-pitched whine. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my suit jacket. He begged me to turn the projector off, telling me I was ruining his life. He said the federal authorities were already after him and that I had gone too far. The microphone picked up his desperate confession, amplifying it for every single person in the room to hear. The senior pastor stood up and signaled for the church security to move toward the stage to intervene. The perfect anniversary gala had devolved into a complete nightmare for my family. But for me, it was the most beautiful moment of absolute clarity and justice I had ever experienced. I looked at my parents' broken faces and knew the hardest blow was still hiding in my bag, waiting to be delivered. Vanessa broke the heavy silence with a piercing scream that tore through the banquet hall. She scrambled up the wooden steps of the stage, her expensive champagne-colored dress tearing slightly at the hem as she tripped over her own heels. She grabbed her husband's arm, shaking him violently with manic desperation. She yelled that the slides were fake and that I was just a jealous sister trying to ruin their perfect life. She demanded that Connor say something to prove me wrong, to tell the entire congregation that it was all a lie. She begged him to tell the church that the money was safely secured in the artificial intelligence startup and that they were still going to be millionaires. But Connor just looked at her with hollow, dead eyes. The adrenaline of his panic had completely burned out, leaving behind a dark, twisted cruelty. He realized there was no way to lie his way out of a federal paper trail displayed on a 20-foot screen in front of hundreds of witnesses. The gig was up and the illusion was shattered. But if he was going down, he was going to make sure everyone else went down with him. Connor ripped his arm away from Vanessa's grip with such force that she stumbled backward. He looked out at my parents, who were sobbing openly at the head table, and a malicious, ugly laugh erupted from his chest. It was a cold, heartless sound that sent shivers through the room. He leaned directly into the microphone and mocked my father's tears, asking Winston why he was crying over a silly little bankruptcy. Then Connor smiled a wicked, vindictive smile. He told my parents that my little presentation did not matter anyway. He said, "So what if the money is gone? The bank is foreclosing on the house anyway because the monthly payments bounced weeks ago." He laughed again, pointing a trembling finger at my mother, and told her she was going to be homeless. He taunted them, saying there is absolutely nothing any of you can do about it now, and that you are all going to lose everything just like me. The sheer cruelty of his words struck my parents like a physical blow. My father clutched his chest, gasping for air as the reality of his total ruin washed over him. The church congregation gasped in synchronized horror. The brilliant white savior they had all worshipped just minutes ago was now openly mocking the elderly couple he had completely destroyed. The deacons who had praised him were now shaking their heads in disgust. Vanessa collapsed onto the stage floor, weeping uncontrollably into her hands as the illusion of her high society life evaporated into thin air. Her perfect marriage was a scam, and her husband was a monster. Connor turned his gaze back to me with a smug, defiant look on his pale, sweating face. He thought he had delivered the ultimate checkmate. He thought that even though I exposed him, I could not save my family from the humiliating destruction he had set in motion. He thought the corporate banking machine would swallow my parents whole, and that I would be forced to watch them lose their family home to a faceless lending institution. He wanted me to feel as powerless as he did. I did not break eye contact with him. My expression remained completely flat and devoid of any emotion. I slowly reached into my structured leather tote bag and wrapped my fingers around the thick red manila folder. The heavy legal documents inside felt like the ultimate weapon of divine justice. I walked deliberately down the steps of the stage, taking my time, leaving Connor standing alone under the harsh projector light. I approached the gold-draped head table where my parents sat, paralyzed by grief and public humiliation. Connor followed me down the steps, his malicious smile faltering slightly as he watched my calm, calculated movements. He could sense that something was wrong, that I was not reacting the way a terrified daughter should react to the news of her parents' impending homelessness. I stood perfectly still in front of the head table. The entire room was holding its collective breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I raised the heavy red folder and dropped it onto the table with a loud, resounding thud that echoed sharply across the silent banquet hall. The thick envelope landed right next to my father's untouched glass of champagne. I looked directly at Connor, making sure my voice carried across the room without the need for a microphone. I told him that the bank is not foreclosing. I explained that his pathetic little scheme was amateur and predictable, and that I saw the default coming the moment the wire transfers hit his shell companies. I told him that I used my private equity firm to buy the entire $500,000 debt directly from the bank a month ago. I watched the color completely drain from his face as the reality of my words began to process in his mind. I told him that the bank does not own the mortgage note anymore. I told him that I do. I told him that I am the sole legal owner of this property now. Then I turned my gaze away from the broken con man and looked down at my parents. My father Winston looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and desperate hope. For a fleeting second I saw the gears turning in his head. He thought I had bought the debt to save them. He thought that because I was his daughter, blood would compel me to forgive their massive debts and let them keep their home. He actually started to reach his trembling hand out toward me, a fragile, grateful smile forming on his tear-stained face. He thought the nightmare was over, and that his family was safe. I did not reach back. I looked at the man who had tossed paper napkins at my children and told them to eat fast food while his golden grandson ate truffles. I looked at the woman who had watched me being treated like an outcast my entire life without ever raising a single finger to defend me. I placed my hand flat on top of the red folder and pushed it slowly across the silk tablecloth until it rested directly in front of my father. I spoke loudly enough for the entire church community to hear every single devastating syllable. I said, "Mom, Dad, I am not here to save you. I bought the debt because I am here to serve you your formal eviction notice." The room erupted into absolute chaos and shock. Several church elders jumped out of their seats, murmuring in frantic disbelief. My father's fragile, hopeful smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He stared down at the red folder as if it were a venomous snake ready to strike him dead. My mother let out another piercing wail, burying her face in her arms on the table, completely unable to process the magnitude of her downfall. Connor stood frozen at the bottom of the stage steps, his mouth hanging open, his malicious arrogance completely obliterated by the sheer ruthlessness of my financial maneuver. He had tried to destroy them, but I had literally bought their destruction and weaponized it to settle decades of emotional abuse. I stood there in my tailored midnight blue suit, surrounded by the weeping and the frantic whispers, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound sense of closure and absolute power. The chaos in the banquet hall was a physical, heavy thing pressing down on everyone present. While the church elders whispered frantically and my parents sobbed over the red folder, Connor realized that a formal eviction notice was the least of his problems. His eyes darted from the projector screen displaying the federal wire fraud complaint to the heavy glass doors at the front of the room. He knew the digital paper trail was bulletproof. He knew I had given the authorities everything they needed. Survival instinct kicked in, overriding whatever scraps of dignity he had left. He slowly began to back away from the stage, his expensive dress shoes sliding silently across the polished hardwood floor. He was trying to use the massive wave of confusion to slip away unnoticed. He turned his body toward the swinging double doors that led into the catering kitchen, hoping to escape through the back loading dock and disappear into the humid Atlanta night. But federal authorities do not operate on the same delayed schedule as local police. The white-collar crime division had been building their net since the moment I sent that secure email, and Connor's physical location at this highly publicized gala made him an incredibly easy target. Before his hand could even touch the brass plate of the kitchen doors, they violently swung open from the other side. Two tall men wearing tactical vests and dark windbreakers stepped into the room. The bright yellow letters FBI were printed boldly across their chests and backs. At the exact same moment, the main glass doors of the banquet hall opened, and 4 more federal agents walked inside, completely blocking the primary exits. The low rumble of panic in the room instantly silenced. Church members froze, holding their crystal champagne glasses mid-air. Connor stopped dead in his tracks, his face turning a sickening shade of pale gray. He slowly raised his hands, his shoulders slumping in absolute defeat. The lead agent stepped forward, his voice booming with authority, cutting through the thick, humid air of the room. He called out Connor's full legal name and announced that he was being placed under federal arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, interstate financial crimes, and money laundering. The agent grabbed Connor's arm, pulling it roughly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed perfectly across the silent banquet hall. It was the sound of a fake empire finally crashing to the ground. Vanessa had been standing near the bottom of the stage steps, paralyzed by the rapid destruction of her life. When she heard the heavy click of those handcuffs, her knees completely buckled beneath her. She collapsed onto the hard wooden floor, her $3,000 champagne-colored dress bunching up around her in a wrinkled mess. She did not try to stand back up. She buried her face in her hands and let out a broken, guttural sob. She watched as the federal agents patted down her husband, emptying his pockets and finding nothing but maxed-out credit cards and the keys to a rented Porsche he could no longer afford. The wealthy country club friends she had bragged to for months were now staring down at her with unfiltered pity and disgust. Her entire identity was tied to the man currently being walked out of the church, and without him, she was absolutely nothing. Connor did not even look at Vanessa as they marched him down the center aisle. He kept his head bowed, staring at the floor, a completely broken man who had finally been outsmarted by the very woman he tried to intimidate. The agents led him through the main doors and out into the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles waiting in the parking lot. I turned my attention back to the head table. My father, Winston, and my mother, Brenda, had stopped crying. They were sitting completely frozen, staring blankly at the empty space where their golden son-in-law had just been standing. The reality of the situation was finally penetrating through decades of deeply ingrained arrogance and blind favoritism. My father slowly lowered his gaze to the thick red folder sitting in front of him. He reached out a trembling hand and opened the cover, reading the formal legal terminology of the eviction notice that I had personally signed. He saw the name of my private equity firm listed as the sole creditor and property owner. He looked up at me, his eyes hollow and completely devoid of the righteous anger he had always weaponized against me. He realized that his obsession with image and his desperate need to be adjacent to white corporate wealth had literally cost him everything he had ever worked for. He had allowed a smooth-talking criminal to steal his $800,000 retirement fund. He had voluntarily signed away the equity of his paid-off home. He had alienated and banished the only child who actually possessed the intelligence and the resources to protect him. And he had done it all simply because Connor looked the part of a successful savior, while I was just his dark-skinned daughter who refused to play the role of the silent scapegoat. My mother Brenda reached across the silk tablecloth, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she tried to grasp my wrist. Her voice was a raspy, pathetic whisper as she begged me to tell her this was all a terrible mistake. She asked me how I could do this to my own family. She said they were my parents and that they had raised me and that I owed them basic respect. I pulled my arm back, stepping out of her reach. I kept my voice perfectly level and calm, ensuring the church elders standing nearby could hear every single word. I told her that respect is an asset that must be earned and maintained, not a blank check to be cashed whenever it is convenient. I reminded her that just a few weeks ago, they watched Connor insult my children and then threw me out of their house for daring to question his financial authority. I told them that they made a deliberate investment in a fraudulent man, and now they were simply experiencing the inevitable market crash of their own terrible choices. They chose to gamble their entire lives on a fake white savior, and they lost. My father buried his face in his large hands, his shoulders shaking as the crushing weight of his absolute ruin finally broke him. There was no angry retaliation left in him. There were no Bible verses he could quote to twist the narrative and make me the villain. The church congregation, the people whose opinions he valued more than the well-being of my children, had just watched him get exposed as a gullible fool who financed a criminal. His reputation in the community was permanently destroyed. His retirement accounts were empty. His house legally belonged to me, and he had exactly 30 days to pack up his belongings and vacate the premises. The absolute devastation in their eyes was the final confirmation I needed. The toxic cycle was completely broken, and the debt they owed me for a lifetime of emotional abuse was finally paid in full. 3 days passed since the massive doors of the Fellowship Church closed behind the federal agents, taking Connor away. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. The local Atlanta news stations picked up the story of the tech CEO who defrauded his own congregation. Vanessa had moved into a cheap motel with her kids, refusing to answer calls from anyone. My parents were entirely isolated in the house they no longer owned. Meanwhile, I was sitting on the sprawling back patio of my gated estate in Buckhead, watching Elijah and Miles play soccer on the pristine grass. My home was a fortress of peace built entirely on my own hard work and forensic accounting career. It was a massive 6-bedroom property, hidden behind high stone walls and heavy iron gates. They never knew I lived like this, because they never bothered to ask. I was sipping a glass of iced tea when the security intercom on my patio wall buzzed loudly. My private security guard informed me that an older couple claiming to be my parents were standing at the front gate requesting entry. They had driven all the way out to my neighborhood. They could not drive through the gates because my security protocol required absolute authorization. I told the guard to open the pedestrian gate, but to keep the main driveway closed. If my parents wanted to see me, they were going to have to walk up the steep quarter-mile driveway in the afternoon heat. I wanted them to feel the physical weight of the distance they had placed between us all these years. I waited on my massive front porch, standing at the top of the wide stone steps. 10 minutes later, my father Winston and my mother Brenda finally appeared at the top of the driveway. They looked absolutely terrible. My father was wearing a faded polo shirt, his shoulders heavily slumped, and his face carrying the deep, exhausted lines of a man who had not slept in days. My mother looked 10 years older, her hair unstyled, and her eyes red and puffy from endless crying. They stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at my massive house, with expressions of complete awe and deep shame. They finally understood the magnitude of my success and the reality of how badly they had underestimated me. My father took off his hat and slowly walked up the stone steps, his hands trembling. He did not look like the proud church deacon who had thrown paper napkins at my sons. He looked like a broken old man standing before a judge. He fell to his knees right there on the hard stone porch and began to weep. He begged me for forgiveness. He said he was completely blinded by Connor's lies and Vanessa's manipulation. He cried that he had failed me as a father, and that he was deeply, deeply sorry for everything he had ever done to make me feel less than my sister. My mother stood behind him, weeping into her hands, nodding along with his apologies. She pleaded with me, telling me that they had absolutely no money left and nowhere to go. She said that the bank accounts were completely drained and that they could not even afford groceries, let alone a new place to live. She begged me to let them keep the house. She said it was the only thing they had left in this world, and that they would do anything to make things right. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the two people who had caused me so much pain. 10 years ago, their tears would have broken my heart. 10 years ago, I would have done anything to hear them say they were proud of me. But right now, standing on my own porch, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I told them to stand up. My voice was quiet, but it carried an undeniable authority that made my father immediately scramble to his feet. I told them that apologies made under the threat of homelessness are not real apologies. I explained that they were only sorry because they got caught betting on the wrong child and lost everything. I told my mother that her tears were meaningless because she never shed a single tear when she watched me cry over my stolen college fund. I walked over to a small patio table and picked up a manila folder I had prepared that very morning. I pulled out a stack of crisp legal documents and held them out. My father reached for them with shaking hands. I told them that I am not a monster, and I will not throw them out onto the street today. My parents both let out a massive sigh of relief, thanking me profusely and praising God for my mercy. I immediately held up my hand to stop them. I told them there is no mercy here, there is only business. I told them to read the front page of the document. My father squinted at the paper, his hands shaking as he read the bold print. It was a standard residential lease agreement. I told them that they no longer own the house they live in. I am the sole owner, and they are my tenants. I explained that the document in his hands was a strict month-to-month lease agreement, priced exactly at current market rate. They would be paying me $3,500 every single month to live in my property. I told them there would be no grace periods and no family discounts. I made it perfectly clear that if a single payment was late by even one day, the eviction process would resume immediately, and the local sheriff would remove their belongings from the property. My mother gasped, covering her mouth in horror. She asked me how they were supposed to afford a market-rate lease on their fixed Social Security income now that their retirement fund was entirely gone. I looked her completely dead in the eye and told her that was her problem to solve. I suggested she get a job at the local grocery store or start selling her expensive custom hats to make rent. I told her she spent her entire life prioritizing appearances over reality, and now it was time for her to actually work for a living. My father tried to argue, his voice weak and pathetic. He asked if there was any way they could buy the house back or work out a payment plan to restore their equity. I told him absolutely not. I told him he surrendered his power the moment he handed his life savings over to a con artist because he wanted a white savior to make him look good at church. I stripped him of his entire narrative. I told him the house is an asset in my portfolio now, and he will never hold the deed again. I handed my father a black pen. I told them they had exactly 1 minute to sign the lease agreement, or they could walk back down my long driveway and find a homeless shelter before sunset. They stood there in the stifling Atlanta heat, realizing that the hierarchy of our family was permanently destroyed. There was no golden child to save them, and no church congregation to validate them. There was only the cold, hard reality of a binding legal contract. My father took the pen, his hand shaking so violently he could barely hold it straight. He signed his name on the dotted line, surrendering the last shred of his pride. My mother took the pen next, crying silently as she signed away her entire life. I took the documents back and checked their signatures. I told them their first rent payment was due on the first of the month and turned my back on them. I walked inside my beautiful, quiet home, locking the heavy front door behind me. I did not watch them walk back down the driveway. The queen had finally taken her throne, and she bows to absolutely no one. 6 months have passed since that sweltering afternoon on my front porch. The dust from the collapse of my family's fake empire has finally settled, leaving behind a landscape that looks completely different from the one I grew up in. The toxic hierarchy that dictated every single aspect of my life has been permanently destroyed, and the harsh reality of their choices has finally taken root in their daily routines. Connor is currently sitting in a federal holding facility in downtown Atlanta. The judge completely denied his bail, citing him as an extreme flight risk after the FBI uncovered a second set of forged passports hidden in the trunk of his rented Porsche. His criminal trial is scheduled for early next year, but his high-priced corporate defense attorneys abandoned him the exact moment they realized his banking accounts were frozen. He is now relying on an overworked public defender to fight a massive mountain of forensic evidence that I personally handed to the government. The man who once mocked my children at a luxury steakhouse and demanded they eat fast food now eats whatever standard issue meals the county jail slides through a small metal slot in his cell door. His white savior complex and his arrogant charm do not work on federal prosecutors. Vanessa's life has unraveled in a way that is almost poetic in its justice. Without Connor's stolen money, and with my parents entirely bankrupt, the golden child was forced to face the real world for the very first time. The luxury vehicles were repossessed, the country club memberships were revoked, and she was formally evicted from her high-rise apartment when she could not make the rent. She is now living in a cramped 2-bedroom unit on the far outskirts of the city. I occasionally hear updates through mutual acquaintances who still attend the church. The woman who once wore $3,000 dresses to a banquet gala and handed out gold-foiled birthday invitations is now working 40 hours a week as a retail associate at a mid-tier department store in the local mall. She spends her long days folding discounted sweaters and standing on her feet for 8 hours a shift just to afford basic groceries for her children. There are no more mimosas on the patio, no more extravagant vacations, and no more smug superiority. She has to look her sons in the eye and tell them they cannot afford new toys. She is finally learning the value of $1 the hard way, without me or my parents there to subsidize her vanity. As for my parents, Winston and Brenda, they are still living in the 4-bedroom house they used to proudly own. On the first day of every single month without fail, a cashier's check for $3,500 arrives at my holding company's post office box. They have not missed a single payment. From what I understand, they rarely leave the house anymore. The public humiliation at the 40th anniversary gala was a fatal blow to their social standing. My father was quietly asked to step down from his position as a deacon because the church leadership could not associate with a man involved in a federal fraud scandal. My mother stopped attending the Women of Faith luncheons altogether, unable to face the pitying stares of the wealthy women she used to brag to. The church congregation, the exact people they sacrificed their own daughter to impress, completely turned their backs on them when the scandal broke. They are living as ghosts trapped inside a rental property that serves as a constant monthly reminder of their catastrophic failure. I have not spoken a single word to them since they signed that lease agreement on my porch, and I have absolutely no intention of ever reaching out. Cutting them off was not an act of revenge, it was an act of profound self-preservation. For 34 years, I carried the crushing weight of their expectations, trying desperately to prove my worth to people who were fundamentally incapable of seeing it. I chased their validation, holding out hope that one day they would look at me the way they looked at Vanessa. But sitting in my quiet home, surrounded by the beautiful life I built with my own 2 hands, I realized that their validation was completely worthless. Their approval was a poisoned currency that I no longer needed to survive. This morning, the Atlanta air was crisp and cool as I walked out of my front door, holding Elijah's and Miles' hands. We were heading out for a weekend road trip to the Smoky Mountains, just the 3 of us. There was no family drama looming over our heads, no toxic group chats blowing up my phone, and no fear of being belittled to make someone else feel powerful. The boys were laughing, telling me about a new video game they wanted to play on the drive. I looked down at their bright, happy faces and felt an overwhelming wave of absolute peace. I clicked the unlock button on my key fob, and the lights of my luxury SUV flashed warmly in the driveway. I helped them climb into the back seat, making sure their seatbelts were fastened securely before sliding into the driver's seat. As I pulled out of my gated driveway and merged onto the open highway, I took a deep breath of fresh air. The invisible chains were gone forever. I was completely and entirely free. Family isn't a free pass from manipulation. Sometimes the only way to heal a toxic dynamic is to buy it out and rewrite the rules. Have you ever had to use your success to teach an arrogant relative a lesson? Let me know in the comments below. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of reclaiming your power. Share this video with someone who might need the courage to set their own boundaries today. Thank you for listening, and remember, your worth is never determined by the people who failed to love you properly.